So you've been spending 2 days talking about all the latest developments. I'm going to change the pace a little bit and talk about things 200 years ago. Let's see. So many people say open source is a revolutionary new way of doing things. It's revolutionary because it's open, it's collaborative, there's a community. This is a new style of innovation. Some people are very optimistic and see that open source is going to replace proprietary provision of software in the near future. I'm going to suggest that while open source is different than what went on in the past, maybe it's not so revolutionary, and there's a past and a history that we don't think about much, and maybe we don't know about much, and continuity with the past is significant here. There's this hidden history of what some economic historians call collective invention. Episodes in the past where it turns out people worked in an open and collaborative community. For instance, an economist, Alessandro Nuvolari, has documented very clearly that the development of the steam engine, which was initially used to draw water out of the mines in Cornwall, was largely developed in the 19th century by a very open and collaborative community. Many other examples are starting to be documented, and historians are becoming much more aware that this history, blast furnaces, steel mills, silk weavers in Lyon, railroads in the United States, early aircraft industry, all examples where there were open communities, collaborative communities, and these were essential to innovation. And of course, these are important in critical industries in the Industrial Revolution. We're not talking about the manufacture of straw hats or anything. So the idea that open and collaborative innovation communities didn't exist in the past is wrong. They did exist. There are some differences, and I'll get to them in a bit. Here's some documentation. This is from Nuvolari's work. This shows one of the monthly publications of the steam engine engineers in Cornwall, where they had exchanged detailed information about what they were doing, how they were designing their engines, and what kind of efficiency they got from them. So there was extensive personal exchange. People would go from mine to mine or mill to mill, depending on the technology, seeing what was there, sometimes working with the different people. People would job hop. There were formal things where, for instance, in the Bessemer steel industry, people would work at one company, learn the techniques that were used there, and then carry them to another company. There were publications. There were industries and engineering associations where exchange took place. So there were a very rich set of institutions for collaboration. And in fact, this was very common. We don't think about this sort of innovation being very common, but it was common, and it was common for very basic reasons that will sound very familiar. One is there are benefits to collaborating. Diverse approaches to technology can be combined to achieve even better results. And collaboration was not necessarily opposed to economic incentives. It was well understood back then, as it's well understood today in the open source community, that complementary service and complementary assets can be key and can be sufficient to provide the economic side of things. So it was the norm, and it was not the exception. Now, it's an interesting side story. What happened? Why was this history forgotten? Why? It's not what most of us learn in textbooks. And if you go to history and technology museums, you're not going to see stories about collective invention. Instead, you'll see stories about great inventors. This is the statue of James Watt, which was initially put into Westminster Cathedral to honor him. But this is the kind of thing you see in museums. Now, heroes, the heroic idea of invention, that there are a few great inventors, it tells a nice story, and that's part of what goes on here. But it's also, so historians have also looked at how the great inventors came about, and it turns out that they came about in part through PR, public relations, that James Watt was really the first person who was identified as a great inventor. And in fact, this statue was developed by a out of a whole campaign by textile merchants, textile industrialists, who wanted to keep the textile machinery that was powered by Watt's invention from being exported out of England. In other words, they had a very narrow interest, and so they promoted this guy as being the great inventor, and because this was critical to England's well-being, this great inventor, we need to sort of honor him, but also slap export restrictions on technology. So how important was Watt? Well, Watt was important. This is a graph showing over time the efficiency of the steam engines, and Watt's responsible for that increase shown in the blue lines. But the community of collective inventors is responsible for the increase shown by that yellow arrow. Certainly Watt was not the only person to make steam engines efficient in Britain. The collective invention community played a very critical role. So the reason we have heroic inventors in this great inventor story, I think, is significantly because it's tied up with proprietary interest. If you go to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, the main Washington Technology Museum, you'll see exhibits that are sponsored by different companies. You'll see a large exhibit sponsored by Jerome Lemelson, who was a famous patent troll. They're putting forward a very, very narrow and specific view of history. So I think it pays sense to look at this history of collective invention, but it also contains a warning. I know many people are very optimistic about the prospects for open source, and I'm very positive about them too, but the warning here is that many of these communities were limited in space and limited in time. They were limited to different locales. There were the steam engines in Cornwall. There were the silk weavers in Lyon. They weren't global. One thing that's clearly very different is that the internet enables global communities to form, and that's one very big difference that open source has over these. But the other thing, and the one I'm going to dwell on for a few minutes, is that these were limited in duration. They only lasted 2 or 3 decades, typically. And it's important to think about that for a minute, because maybe that portends something about open source. We don't want to be too heady or too arrogant. What was it about these that made them last for a shorter period of time, for a limited period of time? Of course, 3 decades isn't necessarily so short, but I think people have a much longer-term vision for open source than 3 decades. And the story is, I think, there were different reasons. Some of it had to do with industry consolidation. In Bessemer steel production, basically a monopoly was formed by combining companies. In some of the other instances, it was because they were tied to a particular local industry and industrial conditions changed. When tin was no longer profitably mined in Cornwall, that industry fell apart. Well, can we say that similar limitations might apply to open source software? One reason was consolidation, as happened in the steel industry. And I think the good news here is that we can point to open source projects that have actually begun in a consolidated industry. So you have monopoly industries like in the operating software on desktop PCs, or in things like Microsoft Office. We've seen a very successful open source projects spring up in the face of consolidation. And I think we can speculate a little bit why, and I'm not going to get into it, but I think there's a positive message there that whatever's been successful there makes the open source movement in some ways resilient against the kind of consolidation concerns that threaten some of the innovation communities in the past. The other thing is, as I said, some of these were tied to local industries, and clearly, as I mentioned, open source is a global community. But the other thing is, people tend to think about software as an industry, and software really isn't the same thing as the prepackaged software industry. If you look at the figures for the US in terms of the percentage of software investment that goes into prepackaged software, it's never really been much above a third. It increased during the period of the great PC boom from the early 80s to the mid-90s, but it's been pretty much flat since then. Most of software investment in the U.S. goes into custom programming, contract programming, areas where open source has some innate advantages over prepackaged software. What about some other problems that people mentioned? People talked about open source having difficulties with user friendliness. And I know you can point to some open source projects that have done very well. Firefox certainly has a user interface that is at least as good, if not better, and probably better than Internet Explorer. But you can also point to a lot of other aspects of open source where perhaps criticism about deficient user friendliness is justified, and maybe there's a structural reason for that. When a business model makes its money on providing service, perhaps it doesn't have as strong incentives to make the product as user-friendly. But still, I don't find that to be a serious long-term concern because, as the same graph shows in a sense that 2/3 of the market out there for software investment is really in areas where user-friendliness is probably of secondary importance. What about patents? Some people raise a concern that patents may threaten open source. And here history has maybe a positive message. Some of these innovative communities in the past were threatened by patents. Perhaps the best example is the U.S. railroads, which began with a very open community. They were threatened by a lot of patent trolls, and so they formed their own patent pools, not to actually exclude anybody, but as a means of self-defense against the patent trolls. But there were also other innovative communities that coexisted with patents, including the Bessemer steel community, power looms in the U.S., in cotton weaving. So there are a variety of methods that were used then, and we're seeing, in some ways, very similar institutions like the Open Innovation Network today, where the borderlines may be uneasy, but it does seem to me that institutions are forming and are in place that can deal with threats from patents, and they're not fatal threats. The other thing is, of course, patents are a burden on proprietary providers as well. I believe Microsoft is the most sued company. Certainly the most sued in the software industry, but I think it may be the most sued currently in all industries in the U.S. So there's not necessarily a disadvantage for open source. So I put all these things together, and I think open source is going to be sticking around. I'm not necessarily convinced, and the history doesn't necessarily provide me any justification to think it's going to dominate and triumph over proprietary software, but the history at least says, I think, a very positive message in terms of open source should be sticking around, and it has some very sound institutions that should be resilient. Thanks.
James Bessen, thank you very much for your presentation. If you have one question for James Bessen, we can perhaps take this question now. Somebody? Or perhaps after? One question. Alex.
I would like to know how you think the Bilski case could impact the patent system in the United States.
I wish I knew. I think it has the potential of, I think that the decision that was handed down so far, I think, has the potential at the appellate level, certainly shows that the judges are starting to hear the noise out there, to realize that there are problems. We had one judge who quite explicitly said, who had participated in many of the early decisions which opened the world up to some of the most egregious sorts of business methods and patents and software patents, said, it's time to rethink these issues, and that he felt there were unintended consequences from the decisions they had made. So I think that's the good news. Whether they get it right, so it's being considered right now in the Supreme Court, and it's very hard to predict what the Supreme Court will do. Whether they come up with a system that's better than what they had, I think it's very hard to tell. But I take basically a positive note away that in this case and in several other cases, the appellate court has made some very good decisions. How does that affect open source? I think the better that the patent system, the more restraints that are on the patent system in terms of having clearly defined property rights and limited rights, I think that's better for open source and better for software innovation in general. Thanks.